everybody, and welcome to the Net English Training Programme, Route to Developing English. This is the second part of session 8, just the really small spectrum of literature through time. I'm Ashley Potts, Director of Subject, and in today's session we will be focusing on literature throughout the 20th and 21st century.
Hey, welcome to our next session as part of the NET English Training Programme. We're on to session 8, which is Literature Through Time. My name's Nathan Corfey. I'm a Director of English as part of NET. And in this session, we're going to focus on the very small task of 4,000 years worth of literature and condensing that into about 20 minutes of a session. So apologies in advance for the things I miss out, for the things I get wrong. There'll be people with far more knowledge about certain topics and certain areas than me, but the aim of this session is really to weave it all together, that we can look at the overview of literature, particularly in its history in the United Kingdom, and start to look for those connections that will help us as teachers in the classroom to give context that's relevant and interesting to the students that we teach.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and as previously stated, this is the second session in this series. So, little brief overview. Nathan did an absolutely fantastic job at giving an overview of literature from pre-Shakespeare right up until the Victorian era. So this session builds on those 4 types of literature that Nathan has previously explored in the previous session, and at the end of this session we will think about the future and what literature means and how we expect it to be shaped. So today's session is going to be delivered in the following segments. So first of all, I want us to think about literature holistically and what are the key components of literature in the 20th and 21st century. I don't think that we can delve into modern literature without thinking about key events and ideologies of the 20th century in particular. We are going to spend a little bit of time on modernism and then postmodernism, and thinking about current literature accolades at the moment and thinking about how literature is celebrated and hopefully offering you some different avenues to explore some really modern pieces of literature, and thinking about the future and thinking about literature in the 21st century and beyond. In its simplest form, literature is defined as written works, especially those that are considered of superior or lasting artistic merit. So something that's valued, something that stands the test of time. To me, I would go beyond that. Obviously, literature does have a particular artistic form. It is valued. It remains powerful throughout different time periods. But I think the most important thing about literature is that it's about people, and that it's a commentary on human behaviour, and it's about what people believe, it's about their ideologies, it's about the actions of people, how they treat others or places. It's about what people feel and an emotional journey, not just a physical journey. And it's about how people relate to places, how people express their identity or struggle to form an identity, how people use their voice, or how people are actually defined as voiceless. Now, on the right hand side of this slide, you will also see a Marxist definition of literature, and it's something that I do believe with. In my opinion, literature is an active agent. It doesn't just stay still, it is fluid, and it's impossible to separate from the politics and the key events of the time that it's written in. And that's what Marxism begins with. It begins with the assumption that literature can only be understood in its full context. And moreover, for Marxists, like I said, literature is this active agent in its social and cultural world, and it exposes wrongdoings in society and offers potential solutions. Or does it cover over the cracks and take us down a different route? So the most important thing to me, and I would always express this to my pupils, is that literature is about people. It is written by somebody who has got something to say, and they've got something to say about the world that they're living in and the experiences of people, places and voices. Now, before we look at specific timelines and key events and ideologies of the 20th and the 21st century, I just want you to think about this idea of every piece of literature being about people and having at least one protagonist. And this is the kind of visual representation that I see a character's journey. It always goes in 4 parts, and there is always a character dealing with people. So we've got those relationships, and we've got different elements of relationships: loving relationships, sexual relationships, different types of friendship and so forth. And we also have an intrinsic link from relationships to love and different elements of love: love for another person, love towards another place, etc. And then another axis to consider is the idea of power and conflict. And whatever journey a character is on, there will be certain situations when that character is powerful or powerless, and situations when that character is in conflict with others, in conflict with a place, or in conflict with themselves and experiencing an internal conflict. Now, it's no surprise that throughout our curriculum at NET, those concepts are threaded throughout. Now, this is the only time that I'm going to mention the curriculum, because for me this session is more about just engaging and appreciating a wider spectrum of literature. But there cannot be a piece of literature without any of those themes, okay, any of those conceptual ideas. And I'd just like you to take a moment to consider, what are you reading now, and how do those conceptual ideas link to your character's journey? So, for example, I'm reading Sharks in the Time of Saviours at the moment, which is a debut novel by K.Y. Strong Washburn. And it's set in Hawaii, and it starts off with a family of 3 children, and they ultimately all move to the States. Okay, so if we think about power applies to them because there's the family dynamics at the start, and obviously that links with relationships and love. The parents struggle so much to be able to send their 3 children to America for a better education. But within those relationships, inevitably there is conflict. There is conflict between the siblings. The youngest child feels that they are always just dejected. And it's this idea that those 4 conceptual ideas are embedded in every piece of literature and linked to the ideologies and the experiences and the key events that the piece of literature was written in. So just take a moment to reflect and think about that. So earlier I stated that I viewed literature as this active agent, something that was fluid, something that was reactive, and something that is impossible to separate from politics and key events. So I would just like us to take a moment or two to reflect on the key events of the 20th and the 21st century. Obviously a very streamlined version for the purpose of this presentation and for this session. So World War I and World War II were the key dominating factors in the 20th century. We also have the 1918 Franchise Act, which gave women over 30 the right to vote in Britain. We've got the global repercussions of the Wall Street crash in 1929. We've got 1947, India and Pakistan becoming independent nations, which is really important from a postmodern perspective and a post-colonial ideology. We've then got the irony that in 1950 we've got apartheid laws passed in South Africa. So again, we've got that continuation of the division. In one part of the world we've got independence, we've got freedom, and in another part we've got restrictions. In the 60s we've got American troops in Vietnam from 65 to 73 with the ideology of communism sweeping through the world and causing chaos and causing fear in the Western civilizations. In 1969 we've got the Apollo moon landing, an advance in science and technology that had never been seen before. In 1989 we've got the fall of the Berlin Wall. So again, as you can see, throughout the 20th century we've got these different elements of restrictions versus freedom. In 1999, I didn't know this, but ISIS was born in 1999. Okay, I thought it was actually later than that. And we go into the 21st century. So we've got 9/11 in 2001. We still feeling the repercussions of that event because the war in Afghanistan is still going on 20 years later. And most recently, I have included COVID-19 as a key event. Surely it'll be a key event. And I've also included the death of George Floyd because that key event has got echoes through previous events, and we've got a huge surge in literature from Black authors, and the idea that I just want to bring you, actually I've just give me a second, and it's linked to a feminist theory that was written in 1984, and it's by Audre Lorde, and she quotes in 1984, "In other words, it is the responsibility of the oppressed to teach the oppressors their mistakes. Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity." And that's still a struggle that's going on, definitely in literature of women. If anybody's read Girl, Woman, Other, the Man Booker Prize from 2019, okay, that's a theme that is echoed in it all the way through. So it's this idea that we've had 100 years or so defined by what? Well, if we go back to those conceptual ideas, it's defined by different types of power, abuse of power, actual conflicts between people, between nations, between ideologies. We've got a conflict of the mind. We've got conflicts between race. And actually looking at the 21st century, more so than the 20th century, it doesn't look like we've kind of learned our lesson, and our literature reflects that. Now, if we spend a few moments looking at the key ideologies of the 20th and 21st century, I won't spend an awful lot of time on these, but we've got the idea of Marxism, the idea of inequality, and obviously that wasn't born in the 20th century, but the early part of the 20th century, it was a dominating ideology. Feminism as well. And obviously feminism isn't just solved in 1918. If anybody hasn't read Girl, Woman, Other, please read it. And it links in feminist ideologies as well as post-colonial ideologies as well. And thinking about giving a voice to those people who've been previously voiceless. We've then got post-structuralism that evolves in the 1950s, I think from France, and at that moment it derives from philosophy, not just linguistics, and challenges the implied order of structuralism that came before it, that there was certain patterns and structures that we had to follow. And then we've got post-colonialism, and we're going to move on to look at modernism and postmodernism. Now, I think that's all I need to say about the key ideologies. And if you're anything like me, when I was at university, I actually really struggled to get my head around those literary theories and criticisms. And I think that's all we need to know for now. But the main idea is that these ideologies are constantly evolving, but also constantly drawing on previous ideologies and challenging and valuing and criticising what previous writers have stated. Modernism is an era of literature that is broadly believed to span from 1914 to the 1950s. And in its simplest definition, modernism is a self-conscious break with traditions and the search for a new form of expression. And it's no coincidence that it is an era of literature that is closely associated as a reaction to the Great War. And key aspects of modernist literature is a focus on the individual rather than on society and as the whole, and in particular the inner self and the consciousness. So instead of exploring technological progress in society, the modernist writer explored the decline of civilization and the alienation of the individual. And what you find in modern pieces of literature is more than anything a criticism of the world that has been experienced so far in the 19th century. So I've listed a few great works. Obviously, again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. So we've got Joseph Conrad in The Heart of Darkness. Now, this is pre-World War One, but this novella is often defined as one of the earliest pieces of modernist fiction. And through The Heart of Darkness, we've got this imperial horror and this bitter critique of colonialism. And throughout the journey of the protagonist on the Congo, they experience restriction and division and systematic abuse and exploitation at the hands of white Europeans. Now, in the 80s, Conrad was criticised for his writing in The Heart of Darkness from a postmodern perspective. We've got James Joyce, The Dubliners, which is defined as one of his most accessible pieces of writing. And in this, we've got a web of place and time and identity, and we've got stories united by the city itself, and it's about individuals stuck in one place, but all of these individuals experiencing examples of corruption, contamination and deprivation, again focusing on the individual. We've got T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which is defined as one of, if not the most important poems from the modernist period, a dramatic monologue that uses an array of different forms. And out of all of these pieces of literature, I would say so far that it's this piece of literature that is reactionary to World War One and presenting the terror, futility and alienation that was an aftermath to the Great War. We've got F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby from 1925, after World War One, but before the Wall Street crash. And I'm going to do a little bit of a text dissection on The Great Gatsby as the modernist as an example of modernist fiction from the 20th century. We then have Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own in 1929, which is thought to be a landmark of feminism and considers the history of women in literature, but also reviews the place of women not just in literature, but also criticises the state of scholarship itself, and again focusing on individuals and how individuals are affected. And key ideologies that are associated with modernism, we've got Marxism and we've got feminism there. So I'm just going to spend a few moments dissecting The Great Gatsby, one of the most celebrated pieces of literature from the modernist period. So, we've got a novel that was published in 1925. So 6 years after World War One, pre-Great Depression in America, and a novel that it wasn't actually celebrated at the time. It was after Fitzgerald died, I think, that it was celebrated as a piece of literature. But a novel that's fueled by flawed characters, all on separate fragmented journeys and bound together by an element of time in these experiences. So if we go into the key aspects of modernism and then make some links with The Great Gatsby. So this idea that it focuses on individuals, and it does, in particular Gatsby's doomed love for Daisy. And if you think about all of the characters that are included in this novel, they are all flawed, and they have all got their individual struggles with certain things within society, within time, and within themselves, the inner selves. If we think about Gatsby's dreams versus the harsh reality, and if we think about the symbolism of the green light, because that symbolism is representative of the future and Gatsby's dreams for the future, but it massively contrasts to the harsh reality of the world that he's living in. We've then got the desperation and the imprisonment felt by Myrtle Wilson, and this idea of consciousness. So instead of exploring technological progress in society, the modernist writer explored the decline of civilization and the alienation of the individual, and that is completely felt within The Great Gatsby. The idea of these social facades and the division between the haves and the have-nots, Buchanan's abuse of power towards Daisy, but also towards society as a whole, the fact that he's elevated and he's got that elevated position as a result of traditional power. And more than anything, it's the failure of the American dream, and the idea that society is flawed, and in the fact that society is flawed and civilization is flawed, we've got the decline of these individual characters, and none of them ferment and succeed in the way that they would want to, especially Gatsby. Moving on to postmodernism, which in many ways is the sequel to modernism. And postmodernism launched in the 1950s, and I haven't actually put an end year to this era. Quite a lot of people believe that postmodernism lost momentum in the late 1990s, but some people believe that it is still going in the 21st century. So first of all, how's it different to modernism? Well, it's influenced by World War II, unlike modernism, which was influenced by World War One, and it is based on an unscientific approach. And it deliberately uses a mixture of unconventional styles and a rejected logical thinking, almost like, well, where has this got us? And Lyotard in 1979 defined postmodernism as a language game with its own rules. Now, in modernism, the tragedy was the loss of the contemporary world, the descent of civilization. Whereas in postmodernism, it actually celebrates fragmentation, and the belief is that this is the only possible way of existence, and it doesn't try to escape the clutches of 20th century conditions. It suggests everything is disorder. So it's the belief that realities are subject to change, and we've got to accept that. We don't try to escape those boundaries, and that apparent realities are actual social constructs which limit individuals. So the key aspects of postmodernism, like modernism, it did reject rigid boundaries, but it deliberately mixed art forms. For example, the use of parody and pastiche, intertextuality, where it actually borrowed and redefined particular forms of particular contents. And it gave a voice to the disorientation and the fragmentation of the Western world, like post-structuralism, and it recognised that it is not possible to have a coherent centre. And postmodernism is supposed to be disorientating to read, because the second half of the 20th century was a disorientating place to live, with all of these different experiences. If we think back to those key events, if you think from the 1960s onwards, we've got the Vietnam War, we've got the Apollo space mission, we've got the Cold War, etc., etc. So we've got a lot of different facets in society, and that's reflected within literature. So some examples of some great works of the postmodern period. One of my favourites, Joseph Heller's Catch-22, which is a satirical war novel, and it's really based on the paradox of Catch-22, where it's this cycle where there's actually no escape, and it reinforces this idea of restriction. Now, it's got a very different form of structure, because like any postmodern text, it deliberately mixes art forms, and it deliberately mixes the structure with loop and flashbacks, and the beginning actually taking place more than halfway through. And in Catch-22, Heller turns his back on the conventional hero and actually shows that a hero is disorientated and is fragmented, and goes beyond the actual conflict in war, and goes beyond the barriers and looks at the psychological context as well. In 1962, we've got A Clockwork Orange, and the film may be a little bit more popular than the novel, but we've got a dystopia created in England in a totalitarian state, and again it is a satire. So it's a satire of extreme political systems, and what Anthony Burgess is saying is these are the consequences of these extreme political systems, and we see the protagonist, this juvenile delinquent, who undergoes state-sponsored psychological rehabilitation, and there's a huge aftermath of that. We've got Wide Saucy, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a second, and then we have Thomas's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which is a savage journey in the heart of the American dream, and a huge contrast to the Great Gatsby from the modernist period. And in that novel, we've got a bizarre hybrid of fact and fiction. Oh no, oh sorry, I thought I'd stopped it there. We've got this bizarre hybrid of fact and fiction with an ill-defined goal in Vegas, and the consumerism of America is still there, but we've got this greed of an America. So that's an overview of postmodernism with some great examples, and you can see there that the key aspects of literature in this period contrast to the key aspects to modernism, but they're a natural evolvement, and it's all a result of being influenced by the world around them. And if we go back to earlier, that idea that literature is this active, fluid agent that changes and reacts to the evolving world. So we're now going to spend just a few moments dissecting a postmodern text, and the one that I've chosen to look at is Wide Saucy, which was written by Jane Rees in 1966. So, like modernism, this novel rejects rigid boundaries, and in particular it shows the sexism and the exploitation of Bertha, of Mrs. Rochester. And what's really important about this prequel was that it was actually written 119 years later than the original Jane Eyre. And instead of seeing Jane Eyre as one of the first feminist novels, a novel which celebrates independent, educated women, what Rees does in this novel is actually completely reject that and focus on the sexism and exploitation of another female character. And in doing so, she deliberately mixes art forms using parody and pastiche, in particular pastiche, where she imitates and criticises the original novel, Jane Eyre, and gives a voice to the voiceless Mrs. Rochester, Antoinette Mason as her maiden name, and then Bertha as Mr. Rochester actually names her. We've got this lovely blend of intertextuality where it's a prequel that is written 119 years later, but it's set in the 1800s. And we see Mr. Rochester in another context. And in doing so, it creates this disorientated feeling and this fragmentation of the Western world. And we see firsthand the powerless being given a voice, Antoinette Mason. And we actually see Mr. Rochester, the hero of the novel Jane Eyre, being criticised for his behaviours, for his ideologies, for his treatment of women. And what we ultimately have is a feminist and anti-colonial response to Jane Eyre. And like post-structuralism, it recognises that it is not possible to just have one coherent centre. And going back to the idea of pastiche and intertextuality, there's lovely symbolism throughout the novel. We've got Antoinette Mason's recurring dream, where she's lost in this foreign place with nobody there, which actually foreshadows her future captivity in the attic in Jane Eyre as this madwoman. We've also got Coco, which symbolises Antoinette's own doom, and Coco the parrot actually having his wings clipped by Mr. Mason, another Englishman, just like what Mr. Rochester does to his Bertha. And then we've got this lovely quotation at the top here, this idea of his clipped wings failed him and he fell screeching, he was all on fire, which has got lovely references, and it's the true form of intertextuality, and it's linking to the final fall of the madwoman in the attic and seeing her character evolving and having this fiery fall from the attic in this almost apocalyptic dream. So now I'd like us to look beyond postmodernism and look at current literature accolades. So at the moment, postmodernism is the last literature era, so to speak, in 20th and 21st century. But I would just like to spend a little bit of time looking at current literature accolades. As an NQT and as a teacher in my early years, I actually wasn't exposed to any of these ideas, and often when you're in the first few years of teaching English literature, you're often overwhelmed with the content of the texts that you were teaching. And what I just want to make it explicitly clear is that you're just at the start of your journey, and the idea is that there's no expectation that you're supposed to know absolutely everything. You're not supposed to be aware of every protagonist, of every ideology, of links between different eras. It's this learning journey, and again, going back to what is a Marxist theory, this idea that literature is fluid and it's constantly forming, and I'd love you to see kind of your literature journey following the same path. So when I was in your position, I wasn't aware of these current literature accolades. I was focused on reading and teaching what was in my curriculum, which I'm sure you guys are. But I just want to make you aware that going beyond that curriculum would actually fine-tune your practice even more and expose you to different protagonists, to different ideas, to different viewpoints, to different use of language and structure, all of which you can then take away from current literature and put into your own classrooms. So first of all, the Booker Prize, which has been running from 1968. Previous winners, The English Patient, and that was recently actually given the Gold Booker winner, almost like the Champions League of Booker Prize. The Life of Pi, Wolf Hall, Lincoln in Bardo, which, if anybody's read Lincoln in Bardo, the form of it is very postmodern, in the fact where it's a very different form of writing. I've never read anything like it. We've got The Milkman, we've got Girl, Woman, Other, which I referenced to earlier, which is an absolutely fantastic novel, and Shuggie Bain was the 2020 winner, and it's a novel set in Glasgow. So as you can see from those previous winners, there's a huge plethora there. There's a huge plethora of time and place and identities. We then have the International Booker Prize, which is a recent accolade from 2005, but from 2016 it's actually been given for specific novels, and the most recent winner was a debut novel by, I think she's from Norway, the writer, called The Discomfort of Evening, and it is incredibly uncomfortable reading, but again exposes you to this disorientated individual who's struggling with not society but individual issues as well. Well worth a read. And we've got the Pulitzer Prize, which is a stateside award, and it's been running from 1917. Previous winners: Gone with the Wind, Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, The Colour Purple, Toni Morrison's Beloved, The Overstory, an incredibly interesting novel, quite abstract as well. Again, similar to Lincoln and Bardo, I've never read anything of it, anything similar to it in terms of the way that it's structured. And if you do check Overstory out, I promise you that you won't look at a tree in the same way again. And we've got The Nickel Boys is the most recent winner in 2020, and The Nickel Boys is just amazing. If you haven't read it, check it out. And the novel prior to The Nickel Boys, also won it by the same author, called The Underground Railroad. Get me words out there. And the fourth accolade that I've included in here is the Women's Prize for Fiction, which is from 1996, and previous winners include Half of a Yellow Sun, which is again the gold winner. We've got The Power, which is almost, it's quite dystopian, The Power, but it's very feminist. It kind of deals with role reversal and supernatural powers there. We've got Home Fire, which has got lovely links with 21st century key events, in particular the birth of ISIS and the Syria conflict. We've got An American Marriage, and the most recent one, Hamnet, which is next on my reading list. I haven't read that one yet, but obviously going back to a period of time that would not normally be associated with modern fiction. So a huge plethora there, and I just want you to be aware that as an English teacher, one of the greatest parts of your own CPD is just to read and enjoy literature, and to question literature, and to criticise literature, and to talk about literature. Not necessarily literature accolades, but I also think social media has created a new movement within literature as well. For example, I eagerly await Barack Obama's favourite books of each year, and make sure that I read as many of them as I can. So far on that list, The Vanishing Half I can really recommend, by Brit Bennett, and I've heard incredibly good things about her first novel, The Mothers, novels that are set in modern day America but that deal with pertinent issues such as what it's like to be a black woman living in America, what it's like to be transgender living in America. I'm currently reading Sharks in the Time of Saviours that I've mentioned earlier. And also Instagram is a great platform to follow some brilliant Bookstagram accounts and to be following literature through that different format, and to be looking at books that you wouldn't necessarily be exposed to. And yeah, check it out. So that brings us to the future, and just a little moment of reflection here. I started this session with the simple definition of literature being written works that are considered to be superior or lasting artistic merit. And again, I think that's a simple definition, and in my opinion, literature will continue to comment on human behaviour. It will continue to comment on ideologies, it will develop ideologies, it will criticise previous ideologies, it will continue to focus on actions between people, people's emotions, how people link with the places that they live in, their identities and voices, and the struggles within those ideals. And most importantly, literature will remain to be this active agent, and it will evolve as our world and as our society evolves. Thank you so much for your time for this session. I hope that you found it useful and that it's acted as a little reminder of key ideologies, of key texts, of key aspects of certain elements of literature, but also, more than anything, a reminder that literature is such a huge spectrum, and to immerse yourself in literature fully will be of huge benefit to you as an individual, but you as a teacher in the classroom as well. And I just want to end on this outcome that I just found on Instagram the other day, when I was planning this session, and I thought it was really actually quite tragic, and but fit in lovely with this idea of literature through time and what we can do as educators to really make a difference. So these figures are from the National Literacy Trust Annual Literacy Survey of last year, and as you can see, it is from Instagram and it's from Penguin UK Books. So between 2016 and 2020, 25% fewer students chose to study English literature at A level, so it's a quarter in 4 years. Nearly 40% of 14 to 16-year-olds agreed that I can't find anything to read that interests me. Only one GCSE English literature course features a novel or play written by a black author. And as part of our role as literature teachers, I feel that we've got to tackle these issues head on and continue educating ourselves every time that we read a piece of literature, questioning ourselves and questioning our behaviours and our ideas every time we read a piece of literature, continue to talk about people, to continue to talk about pressing issues, and being able to transfer that into our own classroom and into the education of the many young people that sit before us on a daily basis. So, not ending on a light note there, I think it's a really, really important note to end on. And that is the end of session 8, All Around the World, part 2, Literature Through Time. I've been Ashley Potts. Thank you so much for your time. And if you've got any questions, any suggestions, any queries, any concerns at all, You've got my email address, currently based at Walbottle and Red House, but please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much and stay safe.